So, I'd like to welcome Lisa Danz and our esteemed panel.
I think I can pull this out of here, right? There we go.
You want to sit in the middle?
I'll sit on the side, if that's all right. Okay, perfect. Great. Well, thank you all for being here. And yeah, this is the State Carbon Pricing Panel. As many of you are aware, CCL has really invested in state and province level carbon pricing as a strategic way of both trying to get something done now and trying to put pressure at the national level to have a price on carbon. So we thought it would be kind of helpful, given that this is a regional conference, for us to learn more about regional and state and provincial efforts. And so we have this delightful panel of experts. We have Bob Archer and Mary Rose Taruc and Danny Cullenward, and I will let them introduce themselves and their work, and then we'll move into a period of questions where I'll be asking questions, and there will be ample opportunity for you all to ask questions later on in the session. So, and then they'll all come back and reflect on any last words that they want to give. So without further ado, I'll let the panelists introduce themselves.
Want me to start?
Sure.
I'm Bob Archer. I'm an economist by education. I was in the Peace Corps in Colombia, and I spent about 25 years working on electricity sector reform, energy regulatory development, and energy efficiency in Central and Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, South Asia, and Southeast Asia with the U.S. Agency for International Development. I have learned from that experience to pay a lot of attention to the issues of weak institutions and the impact of corruption on energy issues in developing countries. With CCL, I am in the process of working with Michael Jones, a retired professor from Bowdoin College in Maine, and establishing an economic policy network as an action team within CCL to answer volunteer questions on a quick turnaround basis. I also give the deep dive in the carbon fee and dividend in the webinar, which will be February 19th. Two things I want to mention in this introduction. One is that whatever level we work at, the problem is global. And this is a quote from Nobel economist William Nordhaus. There are billions of individuals, millions of firms, thousands of governments, hundreds of nations, and for all of them to take action, they're going to have incentives, and we can raise the price of carbon-intensive goods and services and lower the cost of the less carbon-intensive. Very quickly, just 4 points that have been shown in the literature to be considered to be really primary concerns people have about carbon pricing. Number one, what's it going to do to the individual in terms of costs? Number two, what's the impact on low-income households? Number three is the concern the government just wants the money for revenues and not concerned about emissions. And number four, that the carbon fee really may not change behavior. And so the dividend deals with the first three, and we have a job to do on the fourth.
Good afternoon. I tend to be loud. I usually speak at protests without a mic. So I'm Mary Rose Taruc. I'm a community organizer for environmental justice and have been doing that for 25 years. And let's see, where am I now? So straight out of college, I worked for the largest environmental justice network in the country, the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice. And my first job was a blessing and a heartbreak. I was tasked with visiting dozens of environmental justice communities across the southwestern United States and northern Mexico, in Native American reservations in the desert, in colonias, factory workers in northern Mexico, in dumping grounds in rural places and the ghettos of the inner cities who are being poisoned by oil refineries and power plants. And the principles of environmental justice, when it was written in the early 90s, really captures in its introduction what I witnessed in these communities, is that 500 years of colonization has really messed things up, and that there are low-income communities of color across the United States and around the world that have borne the burden of our environmental destruction, and that the analysis around white supremacy, capitalism, industrialization is tied to how we're going to undo the problem. And so when we're talking about solutions to climate change, we have to come with an analysis of that deep in order to undo what we know and what we've seen cause the climate crisis. And so it is with this worldview that I will answer questions on this panel, and is with that worldview that I've helped coordinate some of the largest climate coalitions in California, coalitions that have helped defeat state propositions that tried to undo AB 32, coalitions that have helped move our climate funds to make sure they benefit the disadvantaged communities across the state, and coalitions that have helped make our state climate agency, the California Air Resources Board, be more responsive and prioritize environmental justice in how they carry out our clean air programs. Thank you.
And I'm Danny Cullenward. I'm a lawyer and an economist. I wear a bunch of different hats for the different jobs that I do. I help run a small nonprofit called Near Zero that's focused on climate policy implementation. I teach at Stanford Law School courses on energy law and climate law and policy. And the bulk of what I do is related to helping to monitor the way the state of California has been approaching its climate goals. And one of the things I do in that capacity is serve on a relatively new body called the Independent Emissions Market Advisory Committee, which is a mouthful, but that's basically the Cap and Trade Oversight Committee on which I serve as the Senate's representative. I have a long background for a relatively young person working on climate mitigation. I've spent a lot of time at the federal and international levels, and for the last 6 or 7 years focused pretty carefully on California. I'll have a lot to say about what's going on in the state, and I think some of the surprising stories of how we got to where we are, which is actually a pretty broken spot that I don't think most people realize. And for me, one of the most interesting insights about working in the state of California, I think that Citizens Climate Lobby and the chances I've had to work with people from this group has a pretty well-engaged sense of how to think about their views on climate policy. Aside from CCL, basically the only consistent allies I see supporting strong and robust climate policy are on the environmental justice side. And I think that's a fascinating observation to make about the extent to which our large environmental organizations are not on the front lines of pushing for advanced mitigation. And I think, to Mary Rose's point, a lot of the perspectives that she and her colleagues bring are so importantly aligned with the ambition that's needed to tackle the scale of this problem. And maybe the last thing to say, which we can get into as we talk about what's going on in the state, is the extent to which many of the leaders in the state who are pushing for more and better action are people of color, and their staffers are people of color. And this is partly because demographically the state of California is in a different place than some of the sort of national examples we think of. But the importance of those voices in those communities in this broader global struggle and in the practical politics of how things get done cannot be overstated. And I say this as like the white nerd who crunches numbers.
Well, thank you so much for those introductions. And yeah. So now this question, all of these questions go to whichever subset of you feels inspired to answer them, as you know. So can you talk a little bit about what are the benefits of cap and trade versus a carbon fee? And we're talking about both effectiveness and whether they're equitable, and any other light that you want to shed on them.
Please. I focused a good bit on the European experience with cap and trade, the emissions trading system, and the New England RGGI, which is a cap and trade system over 168 thermal power plants, also on the carbon tax policies in the United Kingdom and British Columbia. So I'm going to focus a bit more on cap and trade because you all have more familiarity with the carbon tax. One of the observations I have is that there is a narrative that I think has not been sustained by the experience, and that is that cap and trade and carbon tax are essentially the same, two sides of the same coin. My observation is that they're very, very different in the decade of implementation that has taken place. One of those observations is that the narratives is that cap and trade is market-based. In fact, I think it is very substantially a government administrative market-driven process. I want to summarize the findings that have led to essentially surplus allowances, low prices, and not that much major clean energy investment in the programs. The first is that the economy overwhelms cap and trade. It cannot adjust to the swings in the economy. The recession of 2009 brought about large surpluses, which meant low prices, which meant not much incentive for investment. The second is cap and trade requires a business as usual forecast where you're going to predict the economy, the energy, and the emissions over a period of years ahead, and then you're going to set your cap based on that. Michael War's analysis of that in a Michigan Law Review article and dealing with the issue of asymmetry of information. You can't get that right. And if you can't get that right, your cap's not going to be right, and you're going to be at risk of surplus allowances, low prices, and low investment. The third point that's across these systems is that regulation, complementary regulation, really is not complementary. It counteracts cap and trade. So complementary regulation is really somewhat of an oxymoron. When you have regulatory programs that are working, reducing emissions, renewable portfolio standard, the other programs, that reduces the requirements on the industries that develop surplus allowances, putting pressure on prices, and it impacts the investment incentive. And probably one of the most significant but least addressed issues is the offsets, the experience of the Kyoto Protocol from 1997 to the present. A system was put in place where developing countries would develop projects that weren't quite economic, but they would be given certified emission reduction units, a new creation, that they could sell to the European industries. So Europe would buy those, turn them in for their allowances, for their pollution, and wouldn't have to buy European allowances. The findings of that evaluation were that poor environmental integrity, 85% of projects, low likelihood that emissions are additional and not overestimated. About 90+% of those came from Ukraine, Russia, and China, which really raises questions about the integrity of the program. So European industries in the last few years have been able to buy offsets, allowances for 40 cents a ton of carbon dioxide, rather than the European price of $5 to $10 a ton.
Did you want to say something, please?
Sure. So I was the co-chair of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee under AB 32 for almost 5 years now. So in this last scoping plan that was approved in 2017, the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, or EJAC, proposed using a carbon fee or a carbon tax instead, and that we wanted the state to study that because we don't believe that cap and trade is actually going to reduce the emissions that we have in order to avert climate disaster. And to me, like, so, you know, carbon fee versus cap and trade versus direct regulations, to us, you know, so what is the purpose of a carbon mechanism? Is to reel down our emissions as soon as possible, because we don't have time. And there are people who are suffering right now from where the emissions are being generated to the receiving end of that around the climate effects around the globe. And so to us, cap and trade is actually not reducing the emissions that we need. And the Air Resources Board, they're so adamant about not actually showing where emissions at a finer level in California are being reduced. So right now they'll say, oh, overall in aggregate, our emissions are decreasing under cap and trade. But when the environmental justice community and other advocates ask, well, are there communities that are suffering more emissions increases, they will avoid actually producing those maps. And this is why the environmental justice community several years ago actually sued the Air Resources Board for choosing cap and trade as the mechanism to reduce our emissions under AB 32. CARB did not need to choose cap and trade. They could choose anything, although SB 32 and other climate bills have changed that. So to environmental justice communities, we want to make sure that we are actually stopping the burning of fossil fuels. And that is the fastest way that we are going to avert climate disaster. So that means, thank you, that means we are dismantling oil refineries, that we are dismantling gas power plants, and that we are plugging oil wells in California. We are not doing that under AB 32 or under the Air Resources Board as they're implementing our climate laws. Why is that? They say, well, you know, we're doing the best we can under cap and trade. And to us, that's not good enough. And so we prefer direct regulations because we think that is the most straightforward way to decarbonize our economy.
So, yeah, let's So I'm going to say something slightly heretical for the purpose of like trying to draw this out, because I think this is, I actually agree with almost everything you both said, but I would put it a very different way. I actually think you can make cap and trade work, at least in theory. And what's interesting is we never do. Understanding the politics of why that happens is really important, because I don't think it's the name of the instrument that causes the problem, right? And I agree entirely, Mary Rose, nothing is really happening of significance, and that's really problematic. But I think a huge part of the problem we're dealing with here is the fact that it's politically quite toxic to use carbon pricing to get things done. That is a critical observation to make. We'll talk a little bit more about revenue use in a second, which is what I think this has really been about in all of the places that have implemented cap and trade programs, certainly in the United States. I think the big challenge you have is the technical complexity of cap and trade makes it very easy for regulatory capture to happen. If a government basically wants to hide its decisions, the easy line that people can bring to the public is to say cap and trade guarantees our emissions go down because the cap is firm. It's called cap and trade. But as Bob points out, these systems always end up with an excess supply of allowances. There are some like good academic reasons why it's hard to do that. You've cited a lot of them. The fundamental truth is it's very, very easy for industry to write the rules, and that's essentially what's happened over the course of the last 2 years in California. So I don't disagree with any of what you guys have said about what's going on and why it's problematic. I think the reasons it's been harder to use this instrument to do more are challenges that face all of our strategies, whether we use direct regulations or a carbon tax. And I think trying to understand the politics of what makes this difficult is essential, because if we're going to use these other instruments to do what this instrument hasn't been doing in California, we need to have strategies that address those political shortcomings. It's one of the reasons, for example, I'm a fan of carbon dividends. I don't have any ideological reason. I think spending money on good climate investments is a worthwhile thing. The practical politics of how you're going to convince people to vote for a bill that dramatically increases carbon prices is just a very, very difficult thing to do. And I know because I've briefed a lot of state legislators on this, and one time when I did this during the cap and trade crisis 2 years ago, 2 of them stormed out of the room in protest. Gasoline prices are going to go up, they said, I'm out. Now that is a problem we all have to work on, whatever regulatory or carbon pricing strategy we pick. But I don't disagree. I think these instruments have been made to be ineffective, and trying to figure out how to make them more effective is a really critical question.
Great. So let's go in the opposite order this time, just so we sort of mix up who gets to respond to whom. How does the use of revenue affect politics and equity? And so that's actually a great segue that you just started with there. And from what we've seen, how well is the use of revenue meeting the intended goals in the places that currently have a carbon pricing scheme?
Would you like to start, or me? I'm happy to.
Go ahead.
I'll just say really quickly, I think the practical way to look at all existing carbon pricing systems in North America is revenue generation mechanisms. When you actually look under the hood of how the systems are designed, that's what they do. Now, there are good reasons to do that, and I think one of the friendly disagreements I've had with some of my colleagues in the EJ community is, what should the purpose of carbon pricing be? Right now, there's a lot of interest in saying, let's bring in revenue and then spend the revenue on projects, particularly in disadvantaged communities, which frankly need more investment and are not getting a fair shake. The problem, the fundamental political problem with carbon pricing, is you make gasoline prices, and to a lesser extent electricity prices, go up, and that's a cost that everybody bears. Good public investment doesn't necessarily benefit everybody. And that's the fundamental political challenge. If we put in good investment into schools and parks and infrastructure to clean up some of the disadvantaged communities that have borne the brunt of a historical legacy of frankly, unequal pollution, there's somebody else in another disadvantaged community who doesn't receive that benefit but pays the higher prices. And we have, I think, a fundamental tension in the very important purpose of trying to drive investment into communities that haven't received it sufficiently, and this political thing that essentially throttles our ability to use any climate policy to go in the direction that science tells us we need to go.
So in 2010, when what is now SB 535, the Community Benefits Fund, was making its way through the legislature, I worked for the Asian Pacific Environmental Network along with the California Environmental Justice Alliance, and we were the primary environmental justice groups working with then Assemblymember Kevin DeLeon, who was now Senator DeLeon, craft the Community Benefits Fund bill. And to us, to environmental justice community, our primary interest is to reduce the pollution that we're breathing. And if the state were going to generate funds through our climate program, then we believe in the polluter pays principle. And the polluter pays principle is that if you're going to pollute and cause harm, you should pay for that harm, and that those funds should go directly to the people who have been harmed. And so when we look at where all the major emitters are in California, those are in environmental justice communities. So we're like, well, if you're going to generate revenue from this climate fund, those who are most impacted and most vulnerable to climate change should get primarily the benefits of this fund. SB 535, when it was passed, authored by Senator DeLeon, dedicated at least 25% to benefit disadvantaged communities, and 10% of the investment projects should be located in disadvantaged communities. Is that the majority of where funds are going? No. But to date, at least half of the, I think, over $6 billion in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund has been spent in benefit of disadvantaged communities. Now, is this producing what environmental justice communities want in our climate programs in terms of reducing the pollution that we're breathing? Not necessarily. Is it giving communities the ability to take on climate projects and improve our communities? I think that's where the revenue has been useful. It doesn't make up for the pollution that's still spewing from our refineries and power plants, but it also has given us a ray of hope in taking matters into our own hands. So we are using the greenhouse gas reduction funds for building affordable housing next to transit so that poor folks can use transit systems for free if the funds went to free bus passes. We can use the funds for free solar for those who, I think Mr. Kamen earlier talked about the inequity of where solar is distributed, or who gets to adopt or have solar on their homes, that we have been able to use those funds to give free solar installations to low-income communities. And we've been able to plant more trees in the concrete jungles across the state. So I think the revenues have have been a ray of hope, but they're not doing what we primarily want our climate program to do, which is reduce emissions, especially where they're being generated.
The intersection of the revenue and politics and equity issue is really central. And I want to just summarize the British Columbia experience, which Nobel economist Nordhaus characterized. When I talk to people about how to design a carbon price, I think the model is British Columbia. Now the summary, basically what they did was put a carbon fee in place in 2008, $5 a ton CO2, going up $5 a year to $30 a ton in 2012-13. They had that consistent trajectory that's familiar to all of us. It reduced emissions. It was progressive because they took the revenues and they reduced the bottom 40% of income taxes by 5 percentage points, had some smaller payments to rural areas, and they had some big corporate tax cuts. That was very important for the passage of that bill, as Danny was implying. Public opinion support was under 50% when they passed that. In fact, they proposed it in February 2008, and 4 months later it was in implementation, which is not the experience of cap and trade. It was a model for Canada. Canada is an extraordinary story where they will begin a carbon tax nationally in certain provinces in the near future. Now, the tax paused at $30 a ton in 2013. Some call it, see, it's a failure. Why did they do that? Because no other province, nobody in the United States, Mexico, China, were doing that. So some of their industries are starting to get hurt. So they paused it at that point. It was really the failure of other countries. Now, what's happened today, the elections took place, and what I didn't mention was that the center-right government in 2008 had an alliance with environmentalist industry and academics and got it passed. Center-left party was against it at the time and came around to it. The recent elections were basically a tie, except there were 3 Green Party candidates elected. One was a CCL volunteer. And they negotiated a deal where the revenue neutrality would be lifted as a policy and some funds spent on clean energy. That narrative has been picked up by anti-carbon tax people across Canada in columns, et cetera. See that third element, you can't trust the government in terms of the revenues, and that's one of the charges that Trudeau is hearing now. You'll get a dividend for a year, but after that, it won't happen.
So for this next section, I'm going to ask what I was hoping a quick question, and then there will be a follow-up. So just so you're aware, we're trying to fit 2 questions into this section at least. So the first, hopefully quick one is, how do we define success for a climate program? Maybe that's not quick.
I'm pausing because I spent almost all of my professional life trying to establish basic facts about the performance of the 5th largest economy's climate policy program, which is considered the leading program, certainly in the US and one around the world. And I think having a clear analytical framework for watching how emissions are going down and why, and iterating on the successes and failures is what we're looking for. How we build that, it's a long answer.
On the ground, when we're in Richmond, California, or Wilmington, California, or Fresno, what we would see as success is if the industries that are poisoning us with climate pollution and otherwise are actually reducing their emissions so that we can have better air quality. Dozens of environmental justice communities across the state are not seeing that. And even though, like I said, CARB will say, overall, as an aggregate, our emissions are trending down and that we're meeting the emissions reductions as stated in statute, if we are not seeing that on the ground, and actually when we do see statewide greenhouse gas inventories, and we see that industrial emissions and oil refinery emissions are either staying the same or increasing, that to us is a failure of the cap and trade system, when the cap and trade system's primary purpose is to take the industrial emissions of California, not the electricity emissions or not the transportation emissions, but the industrial emissions of California, and drive that down through the mechanism that they choose. And we are not seeing that on the ground, then that is a failure of the climate mechanism that we have in California.
I agree strongly with both things you have said, and I think this is the post hoc fallacy. The rooster crows, the sun comes up, the rooster made the sun come up. I've seen the narrative. Cap and trade is in place, emissions went down, therefore cap and trade made the emissions go down. Definition of success of a policy has to be that that policy caused emissions to go down. In the New England Reggie, emissions dropped 34% in the first year because of the recession, creating a huge gap under the cap, surplus allowances, and $3 carbon price for a decade. So they changed the definition of success. It became the revenues which were redistributed to the 9 states for the pretty good energy efficiency, LIHEAP and other programs, and the renewable energy programs. So the policy has to have causality within it.
Thanks. And as a follow-up, and we touched on a little bit of this in the last answer, but do you think that the California Climate Program, the price on carbon and a suite of regulatory programs, has been successful? And what are the benefits and drawbacks?
So our electricity sector policies, I think, have been enormously successful. We have just a remarkable track record of bringing renewables online and getting rid of coal imports. Lots of important work done in that sector through regulatory mechanisms. They've been great. The cap and trade program has done very little, maybe nothing, in my view. And I think it's important for folks to know the state has an official strategy for how to get to its 2030 climate target, which is 40% below its 1990 year emissions levels. This is like the beginning of deep decarbonization, and it's one of the few places in the world where there's a legal requirement to do this. This strategy relies on the cap and trade program to do about half of the necessary work, and the board in December passed an industry design system that's intentionally not going to do that. We actually right now have essentially a new form of climate denial in the state, and it's the plan that was established over the last year and a half as part of an industry-fueled compromise to pretend that cap and trade was going to do the work while ensuring that it would never raise prices to affect the covered facilities in a way that would cause them to change their behavior. And that's, I mean, it's just that those are the stark, uncomfortable facts. The regulator had in fact admitted in December that they intend for the prices to stay at the program's minimum price floor, turning it into what I like to call the world's most complicated carbon tax. We have a very low and complex and opaque carbon tax in the state. It is nowhere near the level of ambition that's required to get to where we need to go. It has sucked the air out of the room in terms of talking about regulatory strategies that might get us there instead. I'm personally agnostic as to the mix of policies we use to get to where we need to go, but right now we're trying to get out of the denial phase, and I think that's, people find that challenging in a place like California, but I also think it's illustrative of the way this process is going to work anywhere. The political momentum exists to create a legally binding framework to do really big action on climate. And learning from that process and what it takes to get unstuck is actually, I think, the most important thing we can do, but that's sort of where we are right now.
I'm going to go rogue a little bit.
Not you, Mary Rose.
I've spent 5 years trying to understand how CARB and the staff works, and the board, and who they get their direction from, and why are they failing so horribly in really like decarbonizing our economy. And so environmental justice group and some mainstream environmental groups haven't always gotten along. And so one of our when the environmental justice movement started, we called out environmental groups for environmental racism. That programs that some environmental groups are promoting actually are harmful to a lot of communities of color. And so when we see groups like Environmental Defense Fund push their carbon offsets and pro-carbon trading ideas into the very hands of Mary Nichols, to then Governor Brown, and then that permeates through the staff, the industrial division of the Air Resources Board. It's hard to penetrate that. And so I think when you look at, I know we're going to get to strategy questions, who is implementing our climate program in California? And you should see what kinds of reports and what kinds of worldviews and viewpoints that they are actually promoting in the implementation of our climate program. And so to us, that's where there's been a stuckness, and it sucks also how we've seen it, because even though there's an Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, and time again, we've advised them to look at direct regulations to reduce emissions of the biggest stationary sources of pollution. There's an aversion to that, and they will say to our face, there's no localized emissions increases. We're doing great. We're meeting our climate targets, and whatever you're saying, we don't agree with. And so there's a culture and worldview that permeates the Air Resources Board and the Industrial Division, and the chair, Mary Nichols, that is in contrast to where environmental justice and where I think we need to make some breakthroughs if we are going to reduce emissions much faster in California and the world.
I second that. I want to focus on comments on regulation more broadly. California's primary focus is regulation. Carbon pricing is secondary and probably did much of nothing, and the Legislative Analyst's Office forecasts not much through the middle of the next decade. But in terms of regulation, coming back to the fee and dividend policy, this policy is going to be very, very impactful, significant with the price trajectory and the equity in the dividend. There will be need for truly complementary regulation to this. There's no question about it. It's a non-issue. It's not an either-or issue. But how do you choose which regulation and what the criteria? Canada has taken a very interesting approach. 3 criterion. Number 1, where carbon tax doesn't have an impact, there's a justification for regulation. Probably carbon sequestration, enteric fermentation, that's cows. Second one is where it doesn't have enough impact. Highly likely in rental apartment buildings where you have a principal agent problem, landlord-tenant problem, and non-market factors undermining it. The third is when you have a regulation that has non-emission benefits, co-benefits like health, which I think is probably some of the things you're talking about. So here's the sobering story on the history of regulation, mandates, really mandates and subsidies. They can be expensive, they can be regressive, and they can have mixed results. In terms of the expensiveness, the Legislative Analyst's Office looked at the Air Resources Board, came up with an estimate that they would cost between $250 and $350 a ton of CO2 removed. That was for multifamily energy efficiency, renewable energy, single family, and some of the car rebates. Regressiveness. Severin Bornstein at UC Berkeley and others did an analysis of the taxes, the subsidies and mandates. What was the result? 60% of the benefits went to the upper quintile of the population. The bottom 3 quintiles, 60%, got 10%. And the worst was the electric vehicle subsidies, where 90% went to the upper quintile. Finally, there are questions and problems that are very well known and being addressed on the effectiveness of regulation. Free rider issues, the rebound from energy efficiency, and some of the misaligned incentives. So there is a need for better regulation and complementary regulation.
In your experience, strategically speaking, what works and what doesn't as far as legislation passed by the legislature, voter initiatives, and regulatory agencies creating policy? And because I'm going to squeeze 2 questions into 1 question because we're low on time, if you would like to touch on the final point of how the state lessons learned could apply to national as part of your answer, please go ahead. And just to continue mixing up the order, let's start with Mary Rose this time.
Sure. So when the environmental justice movement first came into being in the early 1990s, a lot of us were experiencing the inequities of pollution, including whose communities got cleaned up and who got the benefits from different investments. And so to the environmental justice movement, our main strategy in promoting and advancing environmental justice is community organizing. We knew that those who are most impacted by the issues and the problems are going to be the best fighters for those, for the solutions that we need. And so environmental justice groups will have a base, a grassroots base from the places that they are, and that the ideas and the energy for winning come from that source. So fast forward to 2019, we've seen in California that you can't, Governor Brown even said, you can't talk about climate policy without talking to the environmental justice folks. So we have a pretty robust legislative organizing in Sacramento, coming from all different communities across the state, where we have legislators that look like us. And so you have a legislature that also primarily, or are more and more so, looking like Black and brown folks. And so in the legislature, in order to move policy, we have been able to have the ears of a lot of the major climate policymakers in the state, because they also feel and experience and see where environmental justice groups are coming from. You will also see environmental justice members that are now on boards. So the Air Resources Board guarantees, because of a bill that we had run, two representatives from the environmental justice community. You will see that in various other boards and commissions in the state. We are seeing folks actually take power in office through that. And so I think when you're trying to change or improve the climate program that we have in California already, are you trying to change it in the legislature? Are you trying to change it in the electorate? Or are you trying to change it in the regulatory arena? And so I think you need to look at who is there, and do you have the right people to push that? And so if you're talking about the electorate, I think back in 2012 when Prop 23 was put on the ballot by the oil companies who wanted to suspend AB 32, environmentalists also looked at, our white environmentalists looked at, okay, if the state is predominantly people of color now, how are we going to partner with communities of color who have civic engagement and voter power in the state? And so they partnered with a lot of environmental justice groups, and our messaging actually worked better than their messaging When oil companies will say, oh, you're just, AB 32 and your climate programs are going to raise gas prices or electricity prices, we are there as low-income folks of color saying, actually, we want this. We want the pollution to stop in our communities, and we're willing to pay for that. And so when you might have the best ideas in your organization or in this audience, but if you don't have the right people to carry the message and to affect that change, it's gonna be hard for you to win. And so I think you need to look at partners throughout the state for whatever you're going to do next as CCL. Look at what partners you're gonna need, and that those partners will likely have environmental justice groups in it.
So I'll just add to that. The Air Resources Board meets in a building in Sacramento. The main hall where they do this is about half the size of this auditorium, and it's typically about as packed as the sort of front section of this room. And the vast, vast majority of people who are there are industry lobbyists. There is occasionally one, maybe two representatives from groups like the Environmental Defense Fund or the Natural Resources Defense Council, and occasionally an academic wacko like me who shows up. That's about it, right? It is a regulation by and for the regulated. When people show up who aren't part of that process, they cause enormous disruption to the nature of that arrangement. So to answer your first question, what do you do? What opportunities do you take? Whatever you've got in front of you. Legislation, regulation, ballot initiatives, I don't care. What I care about is getting the ball across the finish line. You have to implement a policy and you have to sustain a policy. And building resilient politics to do that is a much more complicated process, and I never see anybody show up at meetings where these big decisions are being made. In fact, the only times I've seen effective grassroots mobilization on this, when people, frankly you, Mary Rose, last fall, brought in a large group of people to oppose international offsets in the cap and trade program. That is a remarkable thing when suddenly the number of people in the room doubles, and they're members of the public, and often they're members of communities of color. And that particular relationship between, it's important to say this, the mainstream, quote unquote mainstream, the national environmental groups are very white. And the standard political model they use is to have relationships with governors and with some legislators and have these powerful levers of control with the media and through elite opinion shifting. That's an important part of the policy process, but it is not the ground game that sustains the politics of changing the way that we use energy in a society like this. And those groups that I see effectively mobilizing that are almost always EJ groups. And I leave that for everybody to think about, because I think CCL is a group that's trying to do that, certainly at the national level, to think about mobilizing people to show up and change the politics. That matters so much more in implementation, and demographically, we are not casting as broad of a net in the climate movement as we need to really make this work in the long run.
What I just heard was the great emphasis and effort at getting the policies and implementation right. I heard a lot about targets, goals, long-term, et cetera, but I think this is where it has to be done. The policies have to be right, whatever the goals are, and the implementation, and what we're hearing is it's not on the mark. I think in terms of approaches and impacting legislatures and others in the approach, just a couple thoughts. You look at Washington State. I read a Sightline blog that said the history of Washington State, which is really one of the most regressive states in terms of state tax systems, no income tax. The rich pay 4% of their incomes in state taxes, and the poor pay 16%. But the initiative was undertaken for a tax. And I think of 14 initiatives, maybe one had passed in the history of Washington State, and an income tax was voted down. So there really has to be a real sober look at how you're going to get to where you go. The legislative and leadership, political leadership, really matters. I look at Washington State, and Governor Inslee, I would say, was passive in terms of the first initiative, where he could have been a peacemaker in the fractious experience on that. And you come back to the state level issue, there's an inherent problem with the border and the economic issues of trade and competition. I think state initiatives, subnational initiatives like Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative are limited as to how much they can do with the price because of that factor. That is not an issue at the national level. So that's, I think we all are very attuned, and CCL tries to make us very attuned to the political issues that we need to build the relationships to achieve.
Well, thank you. And we're about to get to the audience question portion of this session. But as a prelude to that, I invite everybody to go ahead and stand up, just because this is a long session and you might want to get your blood moving for a minute. And while you're standing, then you might think about moving up to the microphone.
It's a question of whether they go right or left first, because I'm sure that we have similar questions.
I had a friend
Do.
who used to do sit-down yoga exercises. People thought it was so sweet until he started doing it.
Okay.
Can we put one of the only women standing with a question, like, towards the front of the mic? Yeah, will you come closer to the front?
Come on, right over here.
Let's put the women up front.
Yes.
Ladies first.
Yeah, you want me to go first? Okay. Thank you. That was super informative. I also found it a little bit depressing. And since this is all about optimism, I was wondering what you see as the most kind of promising development in or optimistic thing that's happening at the state level carbon pricing right now.
I got something good. So first of all, I don't think it's depressing. I think it's realistic, and I teach students all the time, and they all go through this depression cycle when they see how bad it is. It is essential to know where you are to get where you want to go, and I take incredible joy in the fact that people are picking up on this and starting to take action. It's really motivating for me. I think another part of this that people don't talk enough about is the role of the California legislature, which is basically where all the good policies have come from in the last 10 years. And there are lots of good people working hard to build coalitions, to bring in bills to fix things, whether on carbon pricing or on regulation. I think there's a lot of potential if we solve these political problems and start real conversations around what's needed to make a big difference. But it starts with saying, where am I right now?
I think with the recent women's wave during the elections is to me like the direction that we're going looks positive. And if I just go back 10 years when AB 32 said, well, you can't get any of your environmental justice ideas in here, but we'll give you an advisory committee. And then fast forward 10 years later, and you can't pass climate legislation without including climate equity and benefiting disadvantaged communities and studying the biggest greenhouse gas stationary and mobile sources in the state. To me, that trajectory is where we're headed. And so the more civically engaged and the more passionate that we are in doing the right thing, and that we are influencing our decision makers or becoming decision makers ourselves in that, then that to me is where hope is.
I don't think the situation is that bad. Look at the number of states where there is a debate going on, how much work has been done and how much of a discussion there is. They're not all getting through, not too many yet at all. But the value of that debate and the publicity and the awareness of it is very high. Hawaii just introduced a proposed carbon fee and semi-dividend bill, which is a very positive from that state in particular.
Right. So I maybe have two questions that are, one question that's actually two. So, but I wanted to start, Mary Rose, by thanking you and the work of the EJAC with the board, and especially on the work that we did together that you guys really spearheaded on getting support for SB 775, which was the cap and trade reform bill that really didn't see the light of day. And one of the questions I had for you was actually for all of you guys, about the likelihood of there being any attempts with some more active legislative and EJ presence on the Air Board, that the issue of having a climate dividend as part of the way that revenues from cap and trade are used is going to have any sort of political legs that you see in the near future. But my sort of the larger question that I have, maybe for Mary Rose in particular, is that what we've experienced, I personally have too, with progressives in California, and not just in California, the view that giving money to people, dividends, is like that the worst thing you can do for people who are lower income is give them money. So we've heard that from Democrats, you know, who are in favor of revenue positive programs. So I'm really wondering about how, because having a really robust climate dividend is central to the CCL, basically to the bill that's on the floor in the House now. But also I think it is can be an element of our existing climate programs in California, irrespective of what happens at the national level. So just your comments on that.
Sure. So the Air Resources Board is under the executive branch, and so the governor sets direction for those agencies. And so we have a new governor. You should, if you have any pull anywhere, you should be getting into the ears of Governor Newsom and so he would give direction to the head of the Air Resources Board. Certainly there are those who are appointed by the legislature, members of the board, so I talked about the two environmental justice Air Board members, as well as, I think there's a growing majority of environmental justice interest on the Air Resources Board, so there's possibility there. But I think if we're gonna pivot from cap and trade or the $12 a ton price of carbon, that's gonna need some signals from higher up. And so I think, you know, spend some time in Governor Newsom's ear. I think your other question about, let's see, your second question about, that it's a bad idea to give people money. I think under low-income people money, there's already a cap and dividend program like in California. It's the cap and trade program under the electricity sector, right? And so you all get your climate dividend checks.
Right. It's on our bill.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it's really small.
Check. Okay. Technical term.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a practice of that. I remember early in the debates around that. Should they go? Should all of it go to consumers, or should some of it go to programs? And even when you go to if it goes to consumers, like which consumers? So here's an example. Who eats strawberries here? Okay. So when there was that fire in Ventura, year and a half ago, the farm workers who were picking your strawberries in the fields had to work when the fire was blazing. And so when there were warnings to make sure that people stayed safe indoors, they were made to work outside. And there's a lot of farm workers who are undocumented. And so when you say you're going to give dividends to folks, those farm workers would not get it, and they also, even though their homes and their jobs were affected by that fire, they're not eligible for federal recovery programs. And so, so I think in the SB 775 debates and discussions, it was important for all us, for low-income communities of color, to also get a seat at how the funds are, decision-making power and how the funds are distributed, because we will advise various things, and that it's not just one way, but that we have the ability to set the direction.
So I'll just add a couple of things, because, how can I put this? So I helped draft SB 775, and for folks who don't know, this was essentially a fee and dividend structure, carbon pricing bill that looked like an awful lot like a carbon tax, but wasn't technically a carbon tax, that Senator Wieckowski introduced in 2017 with the support of then President of the State Senate, Kevin De Leon. And that grew out of a long working relationship, frankly, with a number of the main environmental justice groups. And one of the things I'm proudest of in that involvement is that the EJ group supported essentially a fee and dividend bill. Now, I can't speak for the exact people and groups. I don't represent those groups. But I will say, I think it's fair to say that the relationship that my colleagues and I had built, having honest conversations about how broken the status quo was, and building trust across a pure climate-focused organization with EJ groups, was essential to coming together and trying to figure out a path that worked for both sides. Because Mary Rose is right, the EJ community is a central part of the politics in California. Last thing I'll say is SB 775 did have a process to make sure that EJ had a voice at the table, to make sure not just that the dividend gets to people, but that frankly it could get to people who aren't documented. And it wasn't explicit in the bill, but if you read carefully, it was open to that. And that was absolutely intentional from a draftsmanship perspective.
So what likelihood do you see there is of that, of SB 775 reappearing?
Depends what you all do.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that's kind of what my statement posing as a question is. Since we all know that carbon fee and dividend is a question, is impossible. How much more impossible will it be to try to get together and solve a number of these problems that are addressed by the Green New Deal, that are addressed by sound immigration policy, campaign finance reform? How much more impossible will that be? And can these things go together through the chute rather than have to get in line one after the other and fight with each other for a place in line?
People used to tell environmental justice groups that that's not how we do things. And so it's the reason why we do community organizing and having the grassroots power to be able to change what's politically possible. And so we're not going to sit around just having them kill us, having pollution kill us. We're going to organize. We're going to come up with solutions. We're going to turn them into policy. We're going to work on getting folks elected that are from our base, and that we're gonna take power. And so it doesn't happen tomorrow, but that's the path to changing what's politically possible. So I think the legislature might be a little bit burnt from the cap and trade extension bill from a year and a half ago. So it's a little too raw still. But it's also a new governor. So I think, you might have the brightest analysis on things. It's good to also have friends who are strategists. So look at what you have and how you're gonna incrementally and eventually snowball change to where you need it to go.
You ready? Thank you very much. This has been a very enlightening panel. Fundamental question is, should CCL be focusing on national only? And what I've heard from each of you is that there is, and particularly Bob's comments, is that when you do a one province proposal or a one state proposal or another, there's always an edge of that, which is fear that our businesses are going to lose out in comparison to the state next door or the province next door. So should we not in CCL just, as far as this solution goes, focus national only?
I think there's value in the state pursuit. It educates so many people, it gets the debate and questions in, and to the extent that something's put in place at the state level, it gets people seriously addressing implementation which is going to come at some point in the future on a national scale. So there's real value in doing that. In terms of being a solution or major impact on global climate change, it's probably not there. But if I understand CCL's strategy, it is to develop as much state activity as you can that will prompt national action.
I'll just add really quickly, people criticize me all the time for only working in California, and I laugh a little at that. But the honest to God truth is that there are some states that are a little farther ahead in the conversation, and the more you learn about the challenges, particularly of implementation, the more you will learn about the strategies you will need in other jurisdictions. So I don't think it's an either or. I think there are benefits to both, but it's not for me to say what CCL should do, just that there's potential there.
If I could just add, we are Amerocentric, Eurocentric, and don't look enough at British Columbia, even. And there are a lot of experiences around the world, particularly for United Kingdom, very quickly. Put in a carbon tax of $8, $16, and $24 on top of the moribund cap and trade. From 2014 to 2017, that fee on coal and gas for power generation reduced coal consumption in power 90% from 2014 to 2017. The power of good pricing in a competitive market.
It's been an excellent panel. Thanks very much. Among the many environmental injustices that I can think of is the fact that PG&E may be able to escape its responsibility for the damages caused by recent fires, particularly the Camp Fire. If I may ask the panel to speculate a bit on the following possibility. We've always had fires in California. It's only since climate change arrived that we have these very devastating fires. If PG&E escapes responsibility, or even if it doesn't, how much responsibility do all of us who burn fossil fuels bear for those damages? And is there some mechanism you can contemplate by which all of us can pay for those damages in a kind of Pigovian tax mechanism?
I am not an expert on the fire side of this. I will just say that I think this is an example where the impacts of climate change are going to start to get real, and I hope that we will consider the cost of those impacts as we think about the willingness to pay for mitigation. I think it's going to transform those conversations over the coming decades. There are no easy answers. I wish I had something useful to say. The cost of living where we live is going to go up, and the less we socialize that risk, the more it's going to fall on people who are least able to do anything about it. Who should pay for what on an individual fire is going to be just a mess that's going to take years to work out. I wish there were more I could say.
Of course, we're all burning fossil fuel, almost all of us in this room.
So in the November Air Resources Board meeting, Danny had talked about a group of environmental justice and Native Californian and indigenous rights groups from South America and Africa who we mobilized to oppose the Tropical Forest Standard, which is an international offsets program. And we almost didn't go because it was when the Camp Fire was raging, and going from Oakland or the Bay Area to Sacramento was almost like doubling our air quality risk. But we went there advocating for the climate policies that we need to really reel in the problem, and so was PG&E. PG&E likes offsets. They're one of the top users of offsets, as well as other oil and gas companies in California, top users of offsets. And they also get free permits, free allowances from the state. And to us, like, how do you reel in the power of these companies? There's climate justice folks who want state control of our electricity companies and our utilities. Why not? This is an opportunity, and also there is a researcher and folks who put out that if fires are being caused by downed power lines or catching fire, and I know in environmental justice communities, a lot of these transmission lines run through our communities, and we've been trying to see how we could be safer from it. And really, the most that we've come up with is when you have renewable energy and rooftop solar, you don't need all those transmission lines. And so if we really sped up our renewable energy plans and had rooftop solar, we wouldn't need all of those power lines in the forests that are exacerbating the problem.
Thank you very much. I've been with CCL now for 8 years, and I've watched the organization grow. It still reflects a certain demographic of older, white, mainly gray-haired folks, and not a lot of color. And over the last few years, I've listened to the organization saying, we've got to connect with the environmental justice community and people of color. And this is the first time, really, that I've heard the opportunity open up for a real alliance between what we are proposing, which is the revenue neutral per capita dividend, where the politicians aren't messing with the funds and distributing it here and there. And you, Mary Rose, saying, I believe you're in agreement, because the fastest way to achieve justice is to lower the emissions, shutter the plants, convert to the renewable future that is coming hopefully sooner than later. So my question is, are we at that point where the bill that's in Congress now, and I'm talking nationally, is going to receive strong support from environmental justice advocates? Yes or no? And what do we have to do to form a very strong alliance with environmental justice advocates?
So on the national scene, I'm not as familiar, but my assumptions around what's possible in the national scene are pretty bleak. And why are corporations or capitalists in favor of, some of these programs? I think what I've seen in California around how you design climate policy, you can have like strong targets, but how you do it also can be poisonous or dangerous. So even though Governor Brown has said, "Oh, we're a climate leader," globally, he won't ban fracking in California. He's been a supporter of some major oil and gas development in California, and to us, that is like what are those poison pills and what are the giveaways to oil and gas and coal companies in agriculture in the national stage that would get you there? And so I think my guess is from the allies and friends that I have in the climate justice movement nationally, that's going to be a difficult negotiation to have in that space. I think in California, it's like, to me, it's like, how can we be sincere partners to each other and see what we bring to the table and how we could support each other's goals? My guess is you have a lot of technical expertise, maybe resources that would be useful to the environmental justice community and for the environmental justice community to be useful in your efforts in having the ears of the electorate, which is majority folks of color and growing so. And so what are the sincere conversations that you and we need to have in order to work well together. So I think it would, those are good places to start.
We have time for one more question, and then we'll move into the closing statements from our panelists.
Okay, this may go a little against the grain, I'm not sure, and you can help me with my possible confusion, but I see a difference between greenhouse gases and pollution, that greenhouse gases are not pollutants. So, and they affect everybody equitably, all income levels. Pollution affects poor people much more. And the question would be, I think the central charming factor of our policy is it goes in equal dividends back to every citizen. And equitability is very important to the passage of this. So my concern comes to any special group getting special treatment from the money going back, you know, and not being distributed to any special group, that it actually go back to every citizen equitably. Now, the impact of this will have tremendous effect on pollution and, you know, the poorer community, not only in the check coming back, but in the lowering pollution. But this is an area that I guess makes me slightly nervous when affected groups, Republican right-wing groups, whoever it is, want to dip into that money going back. It makes me a little nervous.
So there is a debate in the Capitol around greenhouse gases being different than the other co-pollutants. I'm going to hark back to when I talked about the principles of environmental justice opening with 500 years of colonization, and the worldview that you take that might be different than what folks of color or indigenous folks would take. In that, to me, the worldview that I come from is much more integrated. Yes, I have an environmental science degree from UC Berkeley, and I spent a lot of time being angry in those classes because it was always my white male professors would always parse out things, and it was like always separating things, and I'm much more about integrating things, and that's why I'm a coalition builder. And so when you put my child in front of the Chevron oil refinery in Richmond and tell him that, you know, oh, well, we're only going to count the greenhouse gases that's causing climate change, and we're not going to care about the co-pollutants that are poisoning your lungs, I will scream at you. And that to us, there's no difference in what's coming out of the smokestacks of these fossil fuel companies. They're the same to us, and that why wouldn't we want to reduce the pollution, all of it, from all of those sources? Is there really a benefit to separating them? Like, would you really just want to control the emissions from the oil refinery that are greenhouse gases and let them continue on their way to polluting the other criteria and toxic air pollutants? Is that what you want? And so, so to us, and then I'm going to call back on the polluter pays principle, that who are the people that are most harmed by the pollution, and are you collecting funds to repair the harm? And so you should give it to those people who have been most harmed by it.
Go ahead. We want to wrap up?
Yeah, well, we have about 2 minutes per person for closing statements.
Okay.
That works.
Think back 2+ years. I'm not a scientist. We have achieved a significant amount in raising the awareness on climate issues, everyone across the board. Across the board, meaning Republicans who have breached the wall of denial that climate change is real, that there is a need to do something, that the human cause is part of that. That's in the House of Representatives. It's in younger people, including Republicans to a significant degree. We have organizations established that now are talking about this, doing this. We had a Republican bill introduced. We had a bipartisan bill introduced, and one before us. It's extraordinary in 2 years, which seems to have passed painfully and very rapidly. And we have 2 years, I think, ahead of us where we can work toward building the relationships. I see commonality with Green New Deal. I see a lot of discussion with Big Green, with industry, and all the other interests. And we are the small, scrappy kid on the block with a small allowance. There are some very big vested interests across this, not just oil industry, but others behind policies that relate to cap and trade, for example. And so there's a lot of discussion and dialogue that we have ahead. I think it's important we stay in our lane and build those relationships and deal with this either-or syndrome where you need to have regulation to deal with the kinds of things you're talking about, direct point source regulation. You need to have this broader issue, that the global issue that we're dealing with. So I think we're in a good place with more work ahead than we have envisioned in the past.
I should start off by saying thank you, people who've taken time out of their days on a weekend to come and hear about climate policy from people who work on it from different perspectives. You are a big part of where the solution is going to lie in the future. I will stress every time I talk, most people are working on trying to advance a bill or an idea to just the sort of beginning point of its life as a public policy. It's critical, and we need more of that, but implementation is where this is really going to happen. So I hope CCL will continue to think about ways it can be effective once one of your bills does become law. The last thing I'll say is one of the things I admire about CCL is the integrity and consistency with which I see members and leaders advocating for basically a sort of core approach to climate policy that I think actually makes a lot of sense from a lot of different points of view. I think one of the challenges with this approach, and one I hope this conversation will help everybody reflect on, is how to start broadening that coalition and the conversation that's required, not just to advance, but to implement the bills that we all want to see. And I will just say, by way of personal confession, I did 4 degrees at Stanford University, and I don't think I had a professional conversation about climate policy with a person of color until about 3 years ago. It is such a different conversation. And as much as I want to turn around and say, hey, Mary Rose, are you guys going to support what I want to do next year? To the extent you're ever going to say yes to that, it's because we've spent years talking, and that I understand you and that you understand me. And that takes an enormous amount of work with coalition broadening that I think is really a big part of the game that the climate movement, being largely a wealthier and whiter and fairly elite and highly educated movement, has suffered from and will need to overcome to achieve its ends. And so I'm really grateful for this conversation and for you all being here.
Who is a fan of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? So I want you to get more comfortable in your body, especially as older white folks, to support the leadership of young women of color in the climate movement. I've talked about the worldview that we're coming from around our analysis with white supremacy, with capitalism, with industrialization, and we have family members who have borne the brunt of those systems. And we've been thinking a long time about how to dismantle this. And so when I've been at United Nations climate summits, I was in Copenhagen and Cancun after that, the vibrancy of the social movements across the world are inspiring, and they look like me. And that we know that it's the systems change will take all of us, and that there also is leadership to that. And I want you to get comfortable and support women, mostly women of color, low-income communities of color, environmental justice groups, and being able to push forward the ideas with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much to our three wonderful panelists. It's been an honor to have this conversation with you.